I'm happy to introduce this evening's speaker, Joann Neuroth. Joann Neuroth is a core teacher of one of our upcoming programs at the School of the Spirit called God's Promise Fulfilled. I know Joann from our service on the board of the School of the Spirit together. I got involved in the School of the Spirit when I did one of their spiritual formation programs, and I cannot overstate the extent to which it had a transformative impact on my life, but very much also powerful for me has been learning to listen to the Spirit in my service on the School of the Spirit board with Joann. Joann is my immediate predecessor as the clerk of that board, but the Spirit called her to a program listening for how we live faithfully in the shadow of empire. Joann will address us this evening from out of the silence. And once she's finished her remarks, we'll return to worship. It is my joy to introduce to you Joann.
In like this. Oh, there it is. Okay. Sit up in your chair. In 1983, when Bill Milliken was finishing his long term as Michigan's 44th governor, I was startled to learn that as one of his unclassified civil servants, I was expected to resign gracefully to make room for the new governor to appoint his own people. I hadn't paid much attention to that when I changed status. So I began looking for another job. And as I made that search, I came across a possibility that seemed really unusually well suited for me from an organization that I hadn't ever heard of before, the American Friends Service Committee. So I applied, and the application and interview process were really unusual. They took me to Philadelphia for 2 days of interviews and sent me to a psychiatrist to assess my mental stability before they sent me overseas. Oh, they were looking for a French-speaking economic developer. And that seemed like it might be me because my job for Governor Milliken was for his Commerce Department, and I was, among other things, teaching financial literacy to small business owners. And I spoke French. The Mennonites had sent me to Zaire as a teacher abroad. So I think, okay, so I go. And so did a lot of interviewing processes that were sort of unusual and startling to me. But then they sent me to have lunch with Sylvia Lotspeech. Sylvia was a member of the organization's governance board, and she was on their personnel committee, and she evidently often did this kind of thing for them while they were hiring. So she met me at the door of her Philadelphia, I think, townhouse, and took me in to have lunch with her. And an extraordinary thing happened to me that day at lunch with Sylvia. The quality of her attention to me was like nothing I had ever experienced before. She was calm and deep and focused, and there was something something expectant about it. I had no Quaker language at all for this, of course, but it seemed like she thought something important might be going to be happening during our lunch. And she was working at a peninsula in her kitchen, and there was some kind of spotlight overhead. And in the circle of light, I was mesmerized by her hands. She was treating the food with care and no wasted moment, just deft movements. And it was like she was kind of blessing the food. And the only language I had, I was a Lutheran liturgical deacon at the time, and the only language I knew to explain what I thought was going on there was, it's as if she's preparing a sacrament. And of course she was, because to Sylvia, who was a Quaker, all of life was a sacrament. And I believe, can you hear me? I see some people with their hands. Am I still need to get closer? Speak louder. Okay, how's this? All right. So, Sylvia was a Quaker, and to her, all of life was a sacrament. And I think now that I do have a little Quaker language for it, that she probably was approaching that lunch as if we were going to have a little one-on-one covered meeting for discernment. And and I felt it, and I even felt invited into it. Extraordinarily, she seemed to think that not only could she do this thing, whatever it was she was doing, but she thought, without any preparation or explanation or qualifications, I could do it with her. And I felt that invitation, and it was compelling. However this woman was living her life, I wanted to know more about it. Today, I would say that Sylvia was experienced at nurturing the spirit in herself and in others. And since that's your theme this year, we're going to talk about it tonight. My own mother, get up to this mic. My own mother, whose spiritual journey was shaped by pastors and sermons and denominational teachings. You can't hear yet? Is there anything I can? I'm sort of touching the mic with my. I'm too close? Oh, there's a sweet spot back here. Okay. And face it. Yes. All right. Give me a sign if I forget this, but I think this is better. All right. So my own mother, whose spiritual journey was, denominational and full of sermons and all the rest, was very, very suspicious of this cult I was getting drawn into. And I remember her saying to me dubiously at one point, well, I suppose Quaker practice might work if everyone did their homework. And you know, my mom wasn't wrong. There is homework. This waiting worship thing, this nurturing spirit thing that we're called to do, it's not empty silence. You know this, but it's not Buddhist detachment. It's not like there are a couple of young moms in our Quaker meeting who say, I don't know what you all are doing, but I'm just here because it's a quiet place where I can come and there's childcare, you know, and that's perfectly good. We all can come in any door we want to come, but that's not waiting worship. There's more to it than that. And so it was years later, after that day with Sylvia, when I had returned home and decided with the AFSC that I wouldn't go to Mali and do this international work they had for me, and returned to my home and looked up in the yellow pages, which were a thing then, and found this little nest of people like those Quakers in my town, and began attending Red Cedar meeting, where I'm still a member, and began learning about Quakers. In fact, it was so many years later that I had served my own term on the American Friends Service Committee Governance Board. After all that, I found a quote by Fran Tabor that explained a lot to me about that extraordinary centeredness that I had felt from Cynthia, and I want to read it to you. Fran says, "The first generation of Friends did not have a testimony for simplicity. They came upon a faith which cut to the root of the way they saw life, radically reorienting it. They saw that all they did must flow directly from what they experienced as true, and that if it did not, both the knowing and the doing became false. In order to keep that knowledge clear and the doing true, they stripped away anything that seemed to get in the way. They called these things, I love this word, superfluities. And it is this radical process of stripping for clear, now termed simplicity. It's this radical process of stripping for clear seeing that we now call simplicity. So let's look together tonight at what's involved in nurturing spirit in this active way. My friend Paulette Meyer has set a bunch of early Quaker wisdom to plainsong chant. How many of you know Paulette's work? Yeah, good. I love it because it embeds in myself somewhere, way below my conscious brain, wisdom that I would not otherwise be able to remember. And I can sort of, and it rises when I need it. So I love that. One of those chants are the words of George Fox. And he explains what has become for me a really important explanation of the sequence that I think is involved in stripping for clear seeing and then embodying that in true doing in the world. So I wish Paulette were here, but she's not. So, and this is the only way I know I can remember them right, so I'm going to sing them for you. So it starts, stand still in that which is pure. Oh, I should have stopped to say, Paulette assures me that the general consensus of scholars is that when he says pure here, he doesn't mean unadulterated or 100% perfect or anything like that. He means what is pure, what is real, what is true, what actually is. So I think I mix the words up, so, okay. Stand still in that which is pure, true, real, after ye see yourselves, and then mercy comes in. So this is my first step in stripping for clear seeing. My first moments of worship are almost all about stopping. Stopping planning, stopping hoping something profound is going to happen, stopping managing the room to make sure worship is perfect, stopping trying to make meaning of it all, trying to get right, trying to know what I'm supposed to do next, stopping setting deadlines and timelines and figuring out what matters, just stop it. Just stop right there and let that all go and settle into what is, to what really is, to the stop pretending the world is what I want it to be or forcing it to try to become better. Just settle with God in what is. And along with that, settle with God into who I really am. Not who I want to be or wish I could be or think I might be or anything else. Just settle with what is. And Fox nails it for me. When I am ready to do that, what happens is that mercy comes in. I find myself tendered toward that world that isn't, that isn't what I want it to be, but is what is. And I find myself with some compassion for myself and for others. My shoulders relax and I am ready to be my whole self. And I have mercy for what is. And I think that's the first step. So did Fox. Okay, so then he goes on. Stand still in that which is pure after ye see yourselves, and then mercy comes in. After thou seest thy thoughts and temptations, do not think, but submit, and then power comes in. So I love that Fox 400 years ago knows me well enough to know that after all that work of stopping and settling in what is, wouldn't you know it, my first instinct is then to think again and try to pick up what it is I'm supposed to do about this thing that is. So Fox says, don't think, but submit. And so for me, that second step is about knowing what is and settling into it. But this step is about accepting that it is what it is, that I am not going to change what is, and it's about giving it over to God. The submission is a choice to ask for guidance in my experience. I know what is, and then I say, okay, God, it's yours. What do I need to pick up or lay down in order to be faithful here? A few years ago, I was introduced to a practice called spiritual companioning, and it's been hugely transformational for me. Because I think before this, when I sat and listened for guidance in meaningful worship, I was listening for insight or a conceptual breakthrough or an understanding of some kind. It was big. And this practice suggests that I just sit and ask very concretely, what do I need to pick up or lay down? And I am still pretty stunned to report to you that something concrete comes, that sometimes it's small, so small you think, well, that can't be God. And sometimes it's so big, you think, oh, not me, but but something comes when I give the situation over to God. And again, I think Fox has got the right word for it. He says, and then power comes in. Because these concrete things, they are actually things I can do. They aren't end war or, dismantle racism or something. They are concrete things that I know I have the power to do. So they happen not when I'm trying to figure out what I should do, but when I hand it to God. And I think that's what Fox is talking about in that second layer of stripping for clear seeing. But wait, there's more. Stand still in that which is pure after ye see yourself, and then mercy comes in. After thou seest thy thoughts and temptations, do not think, but submit. And then power comes in. Stand still in that which shows and discovers, for there doth strength immediately come. All right, so this one might not seem like a big step beyond asking for the guidance, but in my book, it is a really big step because it's really hard. Then I have to, having received the guidance, I have to stand still and make my decision about what I'm going to do with that guidance. It's the light has shown and discovered something for me. Am I going to walk away? Or am I going to take it seriously enough to try it and see what happens when I follow Spirit's lead? And that's, and he's right that, again, there's strength in that. Like these things that I can do, it takes some get up and go to say, all right, you're not going to just understand this, Joann. You're going to put it into practice in your life. You're going to, Fran Tabor would have said, you're going to take the clear seeing and make the doing true. And that choice to experiment with the Spirit and give God my life, I think that's the next step. So there's one more. Stand still in that which is pure, after ye see yourself, and then mercy comes in. After thou seest thy thoughts and temptations, do not think, but submit, and then power comes in. Stand still in that which shows and discovers, for there doth strength immediately come. Oh, stand still in the light and submit to it, and the other will be hushed and gone, and then contentment comes. Yeah, that's what I think is involved when we take seriously the challenge to strip for clear seeing and then step into embodying it in the world and keeping our doing true. Now, do I really think Sylvia Lott's speech went through those steps one at a time while she was waiting for me to come to lunch? No, I don't. But I do think that Sylvia was experienced enough at this that it came organically and naturally for her. I think that she was an old enough hand at this that she was really ready for everyday discernment while she waited for us. And I think that while she wouldn't have used the steps, I think she would have recognized each one of those as part of her way of being in the world. The stilling herself, the asking for guidance, the choice to submit herself to the guidance, and then the joy of feeling the experience of moving into that. Some of us, Lily included, were at a conference center recently, and there was something on the wall that has really stuck with me. It talked about becoming like a hollow reed through which the breath of Spirit could blow like a flute. And I think Sylvia, I think I felt the breath of Spirit fluting through Sylvia that day. And I think it's possible for every one of us. In fact, you'll hear by the end tonight that I don't think it's just possible for us. I think the world needs this. I think this is something that we have that is desperately needed in the world today. I think if we don't do this, we are not being God's hands and feet as God works to turn the world. So my own recent life experience challenge with trying to do this came, in fact, with some of the events that Lily told you about in the introduction. The School of the Spirit has, for 40 years, offered programs that are designed to invite mostly Quakers, but anyone, into the contemplative depths of real transformational relationship with the divine. And the course that we'd been doing that with since whenever the beginning date was, we laid it down in 2019 because a bunch of things just weren't working anymore. And we said, until we're clearer about how to go forward, we're going to take a sabbatical from this. And 4 years later, in 2023, we were still praying and waiting for way to open. And I will tell you that I don't know about the others, but I was not in hollow reed mode. I was getting a little aggravated, and I spent my prayer time that day ranting a little bit at God and saying, all right, you don't want to release us from this call, then get down here and show us a teacher, for heaven's sake. Like, what is this? We have tried everything and nothing is working. And I don't know why there aren't people lining up at the door to teach this class. Like, what a phenomenal opportunity. It's like, what is wrong with you? And so you may have noticed in there that however gracelessly I did it, I did turn it over. You know, like I said, we're at our wits' end. I don't have any more ideas, God. What should we do? And it turns out that's good enough. You don't have to be graceful about it. So I asked for guidance, and the guidance, and here's what I heard. What if the teacher you've been looking for 4 years is you? I was like, okay, so I was no better at the next step than I was at accepting the guidance. I was like, oh, you have got to be kidding. Like, that is not even possible. I'm clerking this board. It'd be a conflict of interest to be a teacher. You can't get, like, this is not possible. And besides, we've been looking to replace me for as many years as I can hardly count, and we don't have anybody lined up. And so it's certainly not time for me to go volunteering for, you can get the gist of that. And yet, there was that choice thing. Like, I'd asked for guidance and I'd gotten it. And now I was either going to walk away from it and never know what Spirit could have done with me, or I was going to have to gather my strength and actually choose to live it. And it was a pretty powerful moment. And so I took a deep breath and told the board what had just happened. And the board, who were luckily in more hollow reed mode than I was, said, Joann, take it seriously. Bring us a seasoned proposal, and you leave the rest to Spirit and us. And it's a year and a half later. And I will tell you that things have come to pass that I couldn't have imagined, much less have made happen. The board is healthy. It's got a new clerk. You know her as Lilith Spider. It's growing. It has 4 active programs. It has a new administrator. You know, all of those things are true. And even more than that, I, who have spent the year and a half doing what I started out thinking of as service, as a program design and delivery, have grown myself in leaps and bounds. Like, I have new parts of me that I didn't know were there, that I wouldn't have known if I weren't trying to make my doing true here. So I understand that now as my effort to be a hollow channel for Spirit to move through me in the world. And here's the key point: in the way that Spirit needs me to, not in a way that makes sense to. myself. So I want to tell you 4 quick stories about others where I think I recognize this same stripping for clear seeing and then courageous embodiment of what we know. I took a course once from a gifted teacher education professional named Deborah Ball. And Dr. Ball, who was a college professor, I was taking her college course, also took time every day to teach a mathematics class to, I think it was 3rd or 4th graders. So she was their math teacher, and she videotaped herself with these 3rd and 4th graders every day and then brought the videos back, and we looked at them as our teaching curriculum. And she was Jewish, and but I am sure that you would recognize the force of a Quaker leading in her conviction that young kids can learn to think like mathematicians and to discover truth for themselves without having it pounded in their head as authoritative, maxims from some textbook. So she had taught them how to do scientific process. They were, these little 4th graders were like, I have a hypothesis and I challenge that hypothesis and here's my evidence. How would you test that? And I was enchanted by watching what those little minds were, stop belittling them, Joann, what those young minds were capable of. It was really inspiring. But, and one day, one of the kids, whose name is Shay, raised his hand and said, I have a hypothesis. And she said, what's that, Shay? And he said, I think, they were learning odd and even. They had been working on, they had all their little counting sticks up there for 21, and then they'd circled pairs, and then they'd noticed whether there was one left over from the pairs, and if so, it was odd, and if not, it was even. And Shay said, I think there's a 3rd kind of number. And Dr. Ball said, is there? How do you see that? And he said, well, when you have an even number up there, sometimes you can draw circles around the pairs, making 4s, and you can do that and it works out right. And sometimes there's an extra pair left over. And I think if there's an extra pair left over, it's a different kind of number. And she said, we'll call them Shay numbers. And she wrote that on the board right up there, odd, even, Shay. And for the rest of the term, this class did all their math explorations, testing to see whether things went differently with odd numbers or even numbers or Shay numbers. And I was loving it, but I was getting more and more uncomfortable. And finally, I spit it out and said, Deborah, how long are you going to go before you break it to them that there's no such thing as a Shay number? And I can still see the look on her face when she turned to me and said, are you sure about that? How would we test it, Joann? And in fact, I'll finish the story before I go on to my learning about it, that by the end of this term, they'd sort of lost interest in Shay numbers because there wasn't much difference between what happened between them and the others. And nobody ever had to say, okay, we don't have Shay numbers anymore. They fell away because they didn't seem to be important to this group of young scientists, mathematicians. Well, okay, what I confronted in that moment when she got me was that she was prepared to stick with these young people and the truths that they were discovering. It's not like the school board was going to, chase her down and critique her or anything, but she was prepared to stand up to parents or anybody who didn't like it and say, yes, in this class, we are exploring whether there are Shay numbers. And I wasn't. I thought it was a great approach. I was thrilled with it. It was a nice exercise. But in the end, my loyalty was to those authorities, the people who knew real mathematics. And I was going to herd them back into line. So I believe that this is an example of Deborah Ball, who, who was committed enough to the clear seeing, the thing she knew in her heart, that she was willing to live into it and to live with the consequences and to act on the basis of it, to stick with her knowing when she was in the middle of her doing. So the next story I want to tell you, I've actually heard in two voices, and I worked on which one to give you, and I've decided to tell it to you both, and tell both of them to you, because they are both about people who are stripping for clear seeing and true doing, nurturing spirit in the middle of hopeless situations. And I think we might need some of that these days. And I think that both of their stories differ enough that they tell you a little bit different about how that happens. The first is named Mitri Rahib. He's a Palestinian Christian, and I've been reading his book called Faith in the Face of Empire. And he starts by laying out for his non-Palestinian readers that the fact of occupation, of even unjust, brutal, deadly occupation, is not new for them. He says, it wasn't just the Romans, but the Byzantines in 332, the Arabs in 637, the Tartars in 1040, the Crusaders in 1099, the Mongols in 1401, the Ottomans in 1516, the British in 1914, before the Israelis in 1947. And over those centuries, his people have experience and stories of their buildings being reduced to rubble, their cities being demolished, their places of worship razed to the ground, their people dragged away in chains. And in all of it, he says, my people don't ask, is there a God? That feels self-evident in my culture. There is a God. The question we ask with anguished voices is, where are you, God? Where are you? Why are you letting this happen? What on earth or heaven could possibly be the meaning in your inaction? The anguish in that cry is real. And what he says when he strips for clear seeing is that my people have discovered experientially that our God is with us in despair. God doesn't run away. God doesn't disappear. God stays with them. God listens to their anguish. God hears their laments, and God does not choose to act, but God is with them. And what God tells them to do while they're enduring this long arc of oppression is to be present, to grieve, to mourn, to rage, to argue, but to surrender to God's timeline. And in the meantime, to live authentically in creative resistance. So finding the freedom to be obedient, regardless of what's passing over your head, is the picture that I take away from this man's doing. And while I was looking for these stories, I ran across a very similar one about Coretta Scott King, who's also the inheritor of a legacy of ghastly injustice and generational genocide. And nevertheless, she chose in the 50s to, I think it might have been 40s. I think she graduated in 51. She left the South where she'd grown up and tried to make a fresh start in the North. She enrolled in Antioch College, where she trained as an elementary school teacher. And she was doing well at finding a purpose for her life when suddenly she was stopped in her tracks by the Yellow Springs School Board, who told her that she was not going to be allowed to student teach because of her race. And Coretta did not take this lying down. She protested and appealed to the school board. No avail. She called on her Antioch governance people, and they said, no, there's nothing we can do about this. She tried to organize her fellow students into a protest about it. And when that also did not budge them at all, eventually she bowed to the inevitable and took the alternative assignment that they gave her, although she did insist that she was not going to be in a segregated school. She said, no, I will not participate in that. So they found her a different teaching assignment, which meant she had to travel farther, and I'm not sure, but maybe stay an extra semester or do something different. So she did that reluctantly, but before she did, she wrote a fiery letter of protest to the local paper and explained what was happening and how outrageous it was and how appalled she was that it could be happening in 1950. And she says this about it later. I'm going to find the right page here. Oh, she says, this was the first time I stood up publicly against discrimination. And I found that I rather liked making waves and being a catalyst for change, even if it was not change I could benefit from. Back for the rest of my life, so I could not afford to back down or remain silent in the face of the continuing injustice that I would inevitably face. Again, I take away from this something sobering but solid about what it means to worship actively, to still ourselves, to ask for guidance, to surrender to that guidance and give ourselves to God to use as God will, without the promise that it is going to change the things I mean to change. I give it to God because it's what God asks of me. And I leave the change to God and God's timetable. That is a humbling and difficult thing. And I think we might be being called to that in these days. My last story, finally, it's about a Quaker. Stephen Grellet came to the United States in 1795. He was from France. He became a convinced Quaker and a very prolific traveling minister. He went all over the world. And his memoir tells us a story about one point where he was following a leading to preach in some place, a particular place, doesn't matter to the story. He was on his way someplace, and he came across a deserted lumber camp, and he entered into an empty building there and sat down to rest. And while he was there, he was impelled. I mean, he did all those things. He stilled himself, he listened, and he heard guidance. He was impelled to stand up in that empty building and preach. It made no sense to him, and he did it. And he reports that once he had been obedient, the call to keep traveling to that place, whatever it was, left him. So he didn't have to go on. He turned around and went back home. And he never had an explanation for himself about what that was all about. But it was in his practice to take seriously the guidance that he asked for and received. And he did, and he was faithful. He says that years later, he was stopped by a man who first asked if he was Stephen Grellet, and yes, he was. And he told Stephen that that years before, he had been on his way back to that deserted lumber camp to retrieve some forgotten tools. And he heard in this empty building someone preaching. And he sat down and leaned against the outside of the wall and was so moved by Grellet's words that he turned his life around, became a Quaker himself and a traveling minister, and owed this to Grellet's faithfulness. Now, really? I mean, I can sort of see getting the courage to do something I know is right, and that it's hard, but I'm going to do it. But I don't know that I've ever been willing to do something that made no sense to me, that was like ludicrous, that if you came across me preaching in an empty building, you'd laugh at me. But he did, and it was what God needed from him at that moment. So I want to suggest that each of these stories, and I imagine you, if we had, if you were all gifted with a plenary to explore them, you could give me other examples in your own life or that you know. But each of these, as I compiled them, what struck me was that as they went about what Fran called stripping for clear seeing, and then aligning their life with their doing, with their knowing, they did it with humility. They did it without the expectation that they were going to even know the outcome, or that the outcome was justice, or dismantled racism, or an end to intolerable suffering. They did it and still grieved and mourned and keened and lamented and experienced the pain of a world that wasn't the way they knew it should be, that wasn't how they believe God wants us to be. But they were willing to live in that world and to bring God the only peace that God asks for from us, which is that we, each one of us, listen inside and make that happen in the world. Give God our peace and leave the rest to God. The Mennonites, back when I was learning French in the beginning here, that I served with in Zaire, are known for and really good at 4-part a cappella harmony. And I have a vivid memory of the 20 or so of us who were assigned in Zaire, sitting in the middle of a rainforest there, belting out a Mennonite hymn that they loved, and I was just learning. It's called the Canticle of the Turning. And once again, with apologies to the Mennonites, I'm going to try to sing it for you so you can see what I find powerful about it. It says, "My heart shall sing of the day you bring. Let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near and the world is about to turn." It goes on for a bunch of verses, and I really believe it. I believe that the world can turn. I believe God intends the world to turn. I believe the world will turn and that it's God's work to do it. But for reasons God didn't explain to us, God chooses to do God's work in the world through us. And God can't can't turn the world until a critical mass of us are willing to open ourselves to be God's will in the world. I have this image of God as sort of prowling through the streets, panther-like, looking for an opening in a human heart that will let God intervene in human history. And we are the ones who have the possibility of living that kind of worship and bringing what our inner knowing into our outer doing, so that God has an opening in the universe. And without us, the lamentation continues. Our parts are often, like I said before, too trivial, and you think, oh, like, not that. Or there's little, they're like, make a sandwich, or trust a kid's truth, or grieve publicly, or write a letter of protest, or sometimes they might be bigger and more prophetic. I don't know what our part is, but I know that the faithfulness with which we still ourselves, ask for guidance, submit ourselves to trying the guidance, and find the strength to actually live into it, makes the difference between whether God has what God needs from us in order to turn the world or not yet. So I hope that we will all live up to the light we've been given, and know that it's enough. Our part, whatever that is, and the rest we leave to God.
I learned a lot about how God calls us to work from my work with international friends. Until then, I'd kind of assumed that the way that we operate on the nominating committee level and what I was familiar with was just the way things were. But I discovered that in asking friends in our part of the world, in North America, largely unprogrammed friends like us, to serve on a committee or in a post, that it was very difficult, as I'm sure the nominating committee is finding it right now in filling our positions here at Illinois Yearly Meeting. And a lot of that was because of the reactions that I often got myself as member of nominating committees, which is, oh, thank you for asking, but I'm just really too busy. I noticed that with Latin American friends, whose lives were certainly much harder than mine and most people that I know here, they almost invariably accepted whatever position they were asked to serve on. And it seemed that the reason for that was that they were assuming that God was working through the nominating committee. And if the nominating committee was asking to do the work, then they were called to do it. And my takeaway has come to be that when we're asked to serve, the nominating committee isn't asking you how busy you are. The nominating committee is asking you to discern whether God is calling you to the work. And as I know from my own experience of resisting some of those calls, but then realizing that whatever I was going through, I was called to the work. When God calls you to the work, you'll never be too busy to do it.
Thank you, friends. Friends, just a reminder that snack is at 9 o'clock in the basement. And Joanna's with us through, is it Thursday evening, and welcomes conversations about listening for the spirit, spiritual discernment. Or
I'll find a shady tree somewhere and you can come sit and talk if you'd like.
I'm always surprised when I come back here how much those trees out there are basically big air conditioners, but that don't use power. Thank you, Joann. Thank you all. The world is about to turn.